With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, he hadn't been here in a minute. He's been busy with other stuff, but we're thrilled to have him back. He's one of them lawyer-type people, but he's doing God's work as a public defender by choice, doing great work with that. We're thrilled to have him back. Zeke Webster, welcome back, buddy.
Hey, Andrew. Good to be here.
Good to see you, my friend. All world of defending the downtrodden and uplifting justice and keeping the blindfold firmly on Lady Justice statues and all the good stuff y'all do.
We're just doing our best day to day.
Let's talk about that day to day because I've got a concern about a narrative. It's not a new narrative. Look, I'm old enough to remember the Bush speech. That's Bush the senior speech where they busted the poor guy out in front of the White House. Supposedly, there's a lot of that was kind of a setup, and he gave the crack cocaine speech. I can actually remember that one. Okay. I remember the crime bill in 94. Okay. Crime out of control is just something that comes up every election, especially when there's other things like the economy going, things like this. We're having one of those crimes out of control type election narratives. You're on the ground, though. You're on that front edge of the legal system, public defender. I know what the stats say. Day to day in the courthouses, the people that actually administer the justice system, does it feel like an epidemic where you guys are at? Just give me a little bit more perspective outside of the narrative and what folks are seeing online.
No, I mean, I haven't perceived any kind of connection at all between the way in which, like, the amount of crime that exists in the world is described on Twitter or on the cable news or whatever it may be, and what I experience day to day. I mean, I always feel like I've got a full docket, but that's just the nature of, how many positions are created and how much funding is there and so on and so forth. But the one thing that I think is important to keep track of when we're talking about, like, crime, how much crime is there and this, that, or whatever, is that I think that there's some sorts of crimes where it's very clear, like, what it is and what it isn't. I mean, the most classic is murder, that if there's a dead body on the ground, there's a dead body on the ground. And there's, and you can have a lot more certainty that, some kind of a homicide has occurred, somebody got killed, and we can measure that clearly, from year to year, from month to month, from place to place. But there's a lot of other things where how much crime you find depends upon how hard you're looking for it. So, for example, if we're talking about, drug possession or some charges related to guns or some property crimes, I mean, there's a whole question of, like, how much are the police looking for? Where are they looking? What is considered a crime? What is considered a misdemeanor? What is considered a felony? And those numbers sometimes say a lot more about what police are doing or what the government currently thinks is important than they say about what is actually happening in people's lives and who actually is being victimized by this or that or whatever it may be. And as far as, are things out of control? Are things better, worse, whatever? I mean, in my experience on the day to day, you couldn't tell really one thing or the other. It's just, cases come in, cases come out. It always feels like there's more cases coming in, but you wouldn't be able to say anything about the larger picture.
Yeah, Zeke Webster joining us. For the naysayers who's maybe going like, well, it depends on where you work in a city that's somewhat known to have some violent crime from time to time. So people can just kind of put that to the side. You get all of it where you work at. But even looking at the statistics just from your own city, the crime rate for violent crime is about an 8.6 per thousand residents. The property crime is 38.9 per thousand residents. This is pretty consistent. The murder rate nationwide is going up, especially in urban areas. That's undebatable. But that's also still comparatively, not that those aren't terrible things, not that doesn't need to be dealt with and handled. There's all this other crime too. Is this a social media thing? Is it if it bleeds, it leads news media thing? They've always fascinated. Is it the true crime genre that has exploded? Why is it that we focus on that murder stuff, but the vast majority of the criminal code system is tied up in things like property crime, misdemeanors, other felonies? That's the bulk of what is actually technically crime that's going on, right?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the ways in which we get our perception of like what is going on out there, how much crime there is being driven by people that have some kind of an incentive uh, to portray the world as more dangerous than it is. Now, I mean, I think it's fair to say that, like, based on international comparisons, the United States has a higher level of violent crime and certainly a higher level of gun crime than a lot of other places. We definitely have a higher level of crime and violent crime than we want. But taking the big picture, crime of all varieties the rates of all types of crime were much higher in the 80s and early 90s than they are today. We had the good fortune to live through a very long, sustained nationwide decrease in the rates of pretty much everything. And now we are experiencing a increase. We still haven't gotten anywhere near where we were in the late 80s and early 90s. That doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean that it's okay for, any of these sorts of things to happen, but it doesn't mean that things are necessarily spinning out of control in the way that you might feel like they're spinning out of control if you're entirely basing it off of true crime podcasts and cable news.
Yeah, Zeke Webster. Here's my problem. I think we have a narrative problem. I think a lot of our political problems start with nomenclature and rhetoric. I talk about this pretty much every show we do. Part of the nomenclature and rhetoric with crime is so many people. I've done it too. We've all done it. You've probably done it. You get that one case that just eats you up, like, God, just put this guy under the jail, right? The thing about crime is, though, we have all the data in the world. Just throwing people in jail doesn't actually do anything to the crime rate or to deter crime. In fact, the opposite is true, is we usually end up making more criminals than we solve. So how do we start changing the narrative and the nomenclature and the rhetoric of, well, when the crime rate goes in, we just need to crack heads and throw more people in prison, because that's not actually working. And in fact, we see now with things like, we've got all the data from the 94 crime bill came up during the last election. It's going to come up that we can look back on now like, no, that it may have solved a few problems. It may look good on TV. It actually created a whole lot of problems as well.
I mean, the one idea that I wish would get farther out there is that I don't think that being a criminal is a thing that somebody is. It is a thing that somebody does. It is an act, right? And I think that there's a common notion out there that, there's a set of people that are criminals, that are dangerous, that don't obey the law, don't respect the rights of other people, and that the solution to the problem having criminals out there is we got to find them and we got to get rid of them, either through the death penalty or put them in prison or whatever it may be. And I just think that is a fundamentally flawed premise. I think that the vast majority of people that commit crimes, even sometimes very serious crimes that cause very real harm to other people, are responding to some combination of the situation they find themselves in, the ordinary, human weakness that we all have, addiction, mental illness, this and that, and what have you. And I think that we have kind of fixated on jails and prisons as a solution, without much in the way of evidence that they actually accomplish what they're supposed to accomplish. And this isn't always the case, but a very, very many people that do commit crimes that are people who have something going on in their life that could be addressed or potentially could maybe even be fixed. And I think in my experience, it's very common when you see somebody that's a recidivist that keeps getting arrested over and over again, that keeps getting imprisoned over and over again. It's very, very common for that person to be somebody with some kind of a mental illness or an addiction component and why they're doing what they're doing. And very many times, you can get, if you approach the situation from the point of like, well, what help does this person need? Then instead of just saying, oh, well, let's lock this person up for another year or another 2 years, and then they get out and then here we are and nothing has changed, you actually try to change something. And then both the people that might possibly have been victimized by future crimes are better off, and the person who's been spending all this time in jail is better off. And so are their families and any kids that they might have in the community that they're from. I just think that that needs to be a much bigger part of how we think about responding to when people do bad things.
Yeah, Zeke Webster joining us. Of course, that's a hard sell because it's easier to just say, punish, punish, punish. The problem is we're doing all the punishment. There is very little rehabilitation that goes. You've seen all the stats. Part of the problem, and as I've evolved a little bit on the criminal justice system. Part of the problem we've got going on now is, and you're on, I hate to say entry level, but lack of a better term for the common person that's not a lawyer, entry level misdemeanors, crimes that involve fines, crimes that involve you got to go to a court appearance, but it may get drug out, this kind of stuff. What's happening too often, though, is this becomes some kind of a snare trap where people start getting caught up in the system and they got to start paying fines and then they got to start dealing with the court systems. And too often, that actually leaves people worse off than before, and it gets them sucked farther into the system instead of dealing with them and putting them back out into society in a more functional way. Is it an overreach to say I think too much of our criminal justice system problem is our criminal justice system is making more criminals than it's solving crime?
No. And I mean, to be even more cynical about it, I'd say that the dirty little secret of a lot of misdemeanor and traffic courts is that often those courts make money for the government. That you have situations out there where there, where police are directing like traffic enforcement and things like that, not with the intent of keeping people safe, but with the intent of bringing in revenue so that you don't have to raise local property taxes or things like that. And it's part of it is that it's a very like chaotic, decentralized system with a lot of different people playing in, and you're in the situation of trying to turn around the proverbial oil tanker, 1 degree at a time. But yeah, I think that the kind of retail level day-to-day crime and punishment story is very often one where you make it harder for people to hold down a job. You make it harder for people to stay in an apartment or keep custody of their kids or whatever it may be. You don't actually make it any easier for the situations that sometimes give rise to criminal behavior to no longer exist.
Yeah, and part of this too, Zeke Webster joining us, I think we need to separate violent crime from other crime, because obviously somebody that's a violent criminal, that's a different beast. But then when you have all these other crimes, too often we just conflate them as crime and we need to punish crime. A lot of this stuff is just behavioral type stuff. They either had a bad day, they made a bad decision, kind of like you were talking before. They had some kind of outside circumstances that put them in a bad situation. Doesn't mean they're not culpable. Doesn't mean they don't need to make restitution either financially or with some kind of a jail term. But I think we conflate those two things way too much, because what happens is if you keep one of those nonviolent people in the system long enough, you're going to make them violent. And we've got the data to show that. I think this is something that needs to be talked about more. I know there's the trope about, oh, they go to prison and they become a criminal. There's the line from Shawshank that's famous, I had to go to prison, learn how to be a crook. There's actually a lot of truth to that, and we're paying for it as a society. We're paying for it as a government. It's expensive to make a career criminal in the criminal justice system, but that's what we're doing too much of.
Yeah, and I mean, the one other thing I would jut in with is that we have, I think that it's worth making a distinction between, violent crimes and like lesser property crimes, things like that. But I think there's a whole other category of crimes that it's not even necessarily something that would always be considered a crime at all. I mean, I would say that I have a tremendous number of cases that I work right now. And all those cases consist of is that the police pull somebody over for some kind of minor traffic violation, and then they try to come up with some sort of an excuse to pull them out of the car and search through their car to see if they can find drugs or a gun. Just over and over and over again, on and on and on. And you get these people that are, charged with a felony because maybe they had a gram of cocaine in their car, or maybe they had a pistol and it was in the glove box instead of visible to the cop, or whatever it may be. And I don't, it's not at all clear to me, what connection that kind of policing has with keeping anyone anywhere safer. I think it is an expression of other political values and other political objectives that people have, and it falls very heavily on particular communities, especially communities of color. But I think that, you know, there's definitely a distinction to be drawn between when we're talking about crimes that really do involve like harm that one human being has done to another human being, versus a lot of other things where that connection to someone else being hurt and being injured is much, much, much less clear.
Yeah, Zeke Webster. All right, since the president put it on the floor, he pardoned the federal marijuana simple possession folks. That's a very small number. It was like 6,000 something. That number's in the 500,000s when you go to state and municipalities. If you took the low-level drug offenses out of the system, again, the lower level where you're at the bleeding edge, where folks get their first charges, for lack of a better term, if that part of the criminal justice system was just kind of stopped or taken away or lessened, how much different would our criminal justice system look right now?
I mean, I'd throw out half my filing cabinet. Like it's
half.
I mean, somewhere in there, yeah. I mean, part of that is the nature of the cases that I mostly work, but I mean, yeah, like a whole lot of the cases rolling through are just simple possession of marijuana, simple possession of cocaine. Things that maybe get charged as possession with intent to distribute, where what that means is it's a couple grams in a scale and a couple baggies or something like that. I mean, yeah, I think it's an enormous amount of what the courts spend their time doing. It's an enormous amount of what the police spend their time doing. And in my view, it's just not really doing anything at all to make anybody safer, happier, healthier, or anything like that.
Yeah, Zeke Webster. The other thing that gets brought up a lot currently is bail and the cash bail system. There's some progressive cities are trying to do different things with it. Obviously, it's political fraud because, look, you don't know what people's going to do. And politicians are scared of it because you're going to let that one guy go, and that one guy's going to go do something terrible, and then it's hung around everybody's neck. Is there some practical bail stuff that we could do? Because obviously the money system, you've got, disproportionately folks that are on the lower income scales that probably don't have the money to do cash bail in a lot of cases, which makes them wards of the system when they probably don't need to be otherwise. I don't want to do utopian dreamscape where we just let everybody go, because that's not going to work either. Is there a practical middle ground here somewhere of just something that might just work better day to day in the court system?
I mean, yes, like there have been a number of jurisdictions that have either abolished or reformed their money bail systems and found that they release a lot more people pre-trial, and it does not have a measurable impact on public safety. I mean, the idea that the only way you can ensure that somebody is going to come back to court, or that somebody is not going to commit new offenses while they're waiting for their court date, is for them to pay money, a set amount of money. It doesn't. I mean, I don't feel like it's an idea that's even really trying that hard to make sense. Like in my jurisdiction, we have most people that are charged with crimes in my jurisdiction do have some kind of a money bail that they're required to post. And most people that are in the jail are in the jail because they haven't been able to post some amount of bond. But we also, in theory, have like a pretrial release program where people are required to maintain contact with the pretrial program and make sure that they have a phone, they like check in and or call people weekly and things like that to make sure that they're aware of when their court dates are and that they're remaining in contact. And if they don't participate in the pretrial and if they stop making those calls, then maybe their bond gets revoked and they put out an order for arrest. Or in other cases, you'll see people put under they'll be given electronic monitoring or electronic house arrest or different combinations. And in my view, I mean, I think that for cases where you do have some greater level of concern that somebody might not return to court, I think all of those things make a lot more sense than requiring people to pay money. And in my experience, the main result of having cash bonds is that you have cases where somebody can't afford to post a few $1,000s, to hire a bondsman to post a few $1,000s or something like that. And then they get told on their court date that if you take a plea for probation, you'll get out today. And if you want to fight the charge, then you're going to stay in for however many months waiting for a jury trial. And They take the plea for probation and they get out today. And honestly, I think that very many people involved in the system are aware of the way in which money bond pressures poor people to accept guilty pleas, regardless of whether or not the plea is fair and regardless of whether or not they're actually guilty of what they're charged of. And I think that for some of the players in the system, that's the point. That's not a regrettable side effect. So, I mean, I think that there are other jurisdictions that have tried it. I think that the data before they rolled it back was that New York's experiment with bail reform was effective. I think it works. It's just that there's a lot of people that don't want it to work because there are a lot of people that want people to be held in jail pre-trial and want people to have that incentive to go ahead and plea.
Yeah, Zeke Webster joining us. So the pushback is going to be because you're going to get that guy that's on his fourth, fifth, sixth charge. He leaves and he kills somebody on his way home. Now, I understand statistically that's the outlier, but I also work in media, so I know how that works. That's exactly what happened in New York. As soon as they did bail reform, every single person that committed a crime, as soon as they were at that, it hit the wires. What do you do to get around? Because let's be fair, that's a bad optic. It looks bad. It feels bad. People just recoil from it. Like, how in the world does that happen? Part of that's probably an accountability problem. Part of it's probably, general sloppiness in the administration of the policy. Part of it's probably the policy itself. How do we push back on that if you're going to push for some kind of a meaningful bail reform? Because it's going, just statistically, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's just politics is always a long slog, and there's no final victories and there's no easy modes or anything like that. So it's a matter of persuasion over time. And I don't dispute that in any kind of system of pretrial release that you have, there's going to be somebody somewhere who is released either because he was released on some kind of non-monetary bond system or because he posted bond and then he got out and then he went and committed some other much more serious crime or whatever it may be. Those cases are always going to exist in at least some numbers somewhere, but you have to point out that that's always balanced out by cases like by cases of people who sit in jail waiting trials for months and months and months and are then found not guilty, or people that are sitting in jail waiting trial and then have something awful happen to them in jail because jails are dangerous and unsafe places to be. I mean, it's, I think the argument can't ever be, oh, well, this is never, like, we're never going to have any bad effects, whatever, of this policy. It's just that we have to be talking about both the good and the bad. And for every one person that is released who it turns out in retrospect they shouldn't have been released, there's going to be many other people who got out and went home and went back to their families, went back to their jobs and their lives, and then didn't do anything at all like that. And we just have to be talking about this and, be honest about the pros and the cons and what all this is worth.
I know there's a legal term to it, but it sounds exploitive to me. And it sounds like we're going to have a hard time pitching that we're getting justice done if you have an exploitive system like that. Am I wrong?
Yeah. I mean, it's sometimes when I'm arguing bond hearings, I just try and boil it down like this, as that I'll say that, if somebody's in jail and he's got a $10,000 secured bond, then what I would say is that, well, what that means is that the opinion of the state of North Carolina is that if this man had $10,000, it would be just fine to let him walk free. But because he doesn't have $10,000, he needs to sit in a cage to wait for his day in court. And in a country where we at least say to ourselves that, we're all created equal, we all have equal rights, and that your access to the justice system shouldn't be determined by how rich or poor you are, I just think that the logic of that can't stand, right? I mean, that somebody who has the money can get out and somebody who doesn't have the money cannot. There's a fundamental unfairness to it. It means that the rights to a trial, the rights to due process mean very different things for the rich and the poor. And I just don't think that we should ever be able to accept a system like that.
Yes, Zeke Webster joining us. My problem with it is, and this is more philosophical than legal, so this is going to be a little pie in the sky, but it needs to be discussed. Is my problem with it is it's not just there's no such thing as the system. I understand there's a system, but the system's like the media. It's like whatever other. That's a group of people. I think we'd say the system and let people off the hook instead of having accountability about it. And then the other part about the accountability of it is nobody wants to do anything other than blame the system, and you never get the individual people doing what they could be doing. This is not people versus the system. This is the government and entrenched people in the government versus people that are not in the government. And that's an unfair fight no matter what you do, unless you have a whole bunch of money and you can fight it. And then they usually leave you alone because now they're the ones without the resources, as we've seen with like the IRS cases. That's the imbalance that above all the rhetoric, above all the other things, that's what really bothers me is we don't see law enforcement and criminal justice. That's the enforcement wing of government. And government versus the average person, especially somebody that's poor or in a disparate group or whatever the case may be, that's never going to be a fair fight. If they don't have the law on their side and they don't have some consideration under the law, people don't have a chance.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I don't really have a lot to add other than I agree. I'll just nod my head over here.
It's one of those things I find frustrating the more I study it and the more, I'll be honest, I didn't think about it a lot until somebody was really close to me and I'm fair to me, had to do a prison sentence that was unjust. And I saw all the hoops they had to jump in through. And I saw, the crap they had to deal with. And it's like, this stuff ain't fair. And not everybody has that experience, but they should read about somebody that's had that experience and at least have some empathy. I'll end this with that. How do we have a better conversation about this? Because the hardliners are always going to point to the worst case murderers and criminals and say, yes, these people are, subhuman animals, which that's still too far, but you understand what they're saying. How do we change the conversation then to no, most of the people in the legal system are folks that have made mistakes, have got caught up in it, but we still need to have some fairness in here in adjudicating what price they do owe society as a whole.
I mean, I just think it's always important to talk about the specific stories of the people that encounter the system in that way. That when we're talking about these numbers and about like low level crimes versus high level versus property crimes, fundamentally it's people that wind up getting put in jails and prisons every day, people that get taken away from their families, from their neighborhoods, from their communities, from their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and children and so forth. And I think that there are a lot of structural reasons that we tend not to see that story as much as we tend to see the story of serial killers and high profile crimes and so on and so forth. But that's the much more typical story of what the criminal legal system is doing on a daily basis. And I just think that it needs to be more of an emphasis because it's the bigger part of what the government is actually doing in people's lives on the day to day. And when you're looking at it just as people trying to live their lives and then they have an encounter with the police and they wind up in a cage, it strikes very differently.
Yeah, when it happens to you, all of a sudden, what's the old joke is like, the victims always want the conservative judge, and when you're the defendant, you want the liberal judge. That kind of the old trope. When it's you in the dock or when it's somebody you love, it's going to treat you differently. So maybe just assume that to start with, and then try to build the system that way. Zeke Webster, you do outstanding work, my friend. I appreciate your insight, especially since you do this on the working end, as they call it, on the day-to-day. So I always appreciate your insight. Let folks know where they can follow you. We'll try to get you on more often going forward, although you're a very busy man getting ready to get a lot busier. Let folks know how they can follow you until they see you on Hertel again.
Probably just hit me up at Don Zico on Twitter. And from time to time, I write things in other places, but I usually put that up on Twitter, so you can just start there.
Yeah, he's a great writer. We need to lean on him to get back to writing once in a while, at least occasionally, because you do good work, sir. I appreciate your time. Zeke Webster, thank you, sir.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.